All right, so we just finished adding our stereo delay, which was our second of our parallel processing effects. And that means we are now up to step 8, which is reverb. Now you might recall stereo delay was all about adding dimension or adding space to our vocal. Reverb is actually very similar in that we use it to add space. And so in Logic, we're going to treat it a very, very similar way to the way that we did our delay. We're going to go right underneath our bus 2 that we have there right now and find an empty slot. And we're going to add yet another bus. So we'll grab bus 3 this time, and you'll see that creates a new aux track automatically for us. And at this point, it's worth mentioning, if you type X, that will open up the mixer. And now we can actually see all of the tracks in our project. And if you've got more tracks than this, you'll have to scroll left and right to see everything. But now you can see, here's our aux tracks. You'll see they're nicely colored, a different color than everything else. And just to review how this works, when we send through bus 1 right here, that means we are sending the result of this signal, whatever comes after all of this, gets sent over to this track through bus 1. This one right here is being sent through bus 2, and then it's arriving at this track that's inputting on bus 2. And then what we just created here is our connection through bus 3. That brings us over to this channel strip, which is currently called aux 3, which we should promptly rename by double clicking on, and we will call this vocal reverb. And you'll notice sometimes that's just a little bit too long, and sometimes it's a little bit hard to read. So some of abbreviations you might see is VOX for vocal, or VOC. And then REV is another good abbreviation for reverb. So that way we can see the whole word there. Now, just like before, you'll notice that these two we're going to see green signal happening in because we have turned up the level here, but notice how we haven't turned up the send knob right here. So this is not going to be getting any signal. You do what you want. So in order to turn that up, remember the quick way is to just double click on it and type 0. Now, I set all of these to 0 on purpose, and that's because I'm going to be using this volume fader over here to control the actual amount of this particular effect. If, however, you were, let's say you were going to be using this reverb, this exact same reverb track for multiple different vocal tracks, then you could use this send knob here to control how much the individual track gets of the reverb. So you don't necessarily always set these to 0, but for our current process, that's probably the quickest way to do it to get things up and running. So now you'll notice this channel strip right here is the exact same thing as this right here. So I can add plugins over here as well. So if I click in an empty slot, I'm going to go down to the reverb category, and you'll notice Logic has 4 different reverbs. They all have their own uses. They all have a little bit different flavor and different sound and different feature sets. For now, we're going to use the Space Designer, which is Logic's convolution reverb. And then for this, we're going to click our drop down up here. This shows us our presets. And you'll see we've got large, medium, and small spaces, and then a couple other things here. For vocal reverb, I tend to use 2 different types of reverbs, and we'll get to that in just a second. But for now, what I want is a reverb that just gives a little bit of ambience, very similar to what my stereo delay is doing. And so for that, I might go with something that's more of a small room. And you'll notice we've got some things like maybe a recording room right here that's got this number refers to the number of seconds it takes for the sound to decay once you've put sound into the room. So generally speaking, the larger the room, the longer this decay time is going to be. So let's go ahead and try this for now. And then let's take a listen. You do what you want. You do. Now, just so you can hear the reverb by itself, I'm going to solo the reverb track. You do what you want. You do what you want to do. And very similar to how we handled the stereo delay, we want to dial this in so that we just barely notice it, but then when we remove it, when we cut it, we feel like we've lost something. So I'm going to gradually bring this up until I feel like I'm just starting to hear it. And then once I reach that point, I'll duck it back just a touch, and then that will be our sweet spot. You do what you want. You do what you want to do. You do what you want. You do what you want to do. You do what you want. Now listen what happens when I remove this, which I can do by either powering off send 3 over here to bus 3, or I can mute the actual reverb track.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do what.
So you'll notice even just a little bit of it gives us some space, some dimension that once it's removed, we really miss it. It does actually make a pretty substantial difference. So that is our short reverb, and that's what gives us what I think of as more ambience, because when we record, we tend to record in very, very dry conditions because we don't want the sound of the room, especially if you're recording at home. You might go into a closet where the clothes are going to soak up all the sound, or you're going to be in maybe an isolation booth, and you're going to be close mic'd. So we want to try to add back a little bit of naturalness of the sound of a room. And we can do that through our space designer. Now I'm going to rename this, instead of just being vocal reverb, I'm going to call this vocal short reverb. And then I'm going to add one more bus, one more send here using bus 4. And this one's going to be my vocal long reverb. And just like always, I'll double click, bring my send level up to 0. And then I'm going to add another space designer. And this time I'm going to go for something that's, it's more about the sound of the tail, the long, spacious sound that I'm going for. So I'm going to search in either medium or large spaces. And we could either go rooms or halls. Plate reverb sometimes sounds really nice on a vocal. So maybe I'll start with that actually. I'll grab something like let's try the hot plate. Now, I'll warn you, this is probably going to be way too much, but we'll just see.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna.
That's a lot, right? So let's solo that and listen to just it by itself.
You do what you want. You do.
That's a lot, right? Now, I've mentioned this before. Try to avoid making mixing decisions in solo. In other words, it makes no sense to pick a reverb when you're listening to just the reverb and you're not listening to the vocal in the context of the rest of the track with all the rest of the plugins and everything that are happening on it. So I'm soloing this now just so you can hear the sound of the reverb. But when we choose a reverb and then set the actual level of the reverb, we want to do it in the context of the full mix. So I'll do the same process as before. I will start it at 0 or negative infinity, gradually bring it up till I feel like I'm clearly hearing it, and then I'll dial it back just a little bit.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do what you wanna do.
And there it is. And then let's compare and contrast between reverb and no reverb.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do.
You can really feel it when it goes away, and that's how you know you've done it right. Is you notice that it's not there, but we don't really notice it kind of in the way when we turn it back on.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna do.
Now, one thing worth mentioning at this point is that the Space Designer Reverb has an output EQ, which can be really nice because sometimes, depending on the reverb that you've got chosen and the other settings that you've got in terms of your vocal, you might be getting too much reverb in a particular frequency that's just kind of muddying up your track. So you can use the EQ over here to help clean things up. So like, for example, for me, it's very common to want to pull out the low end of the reverb so that I'm not adding more muddiness down to the low end of the track.
You do what you want.
I'm going to turn this up so we can really hear it.
You do what you want.
We'll even solo it.
You do what you want.
Compare that with the EQ off.
You do what you want.
You can really hear there's just a lot of garbage sound that's happening down here.
You do.
Here's the EQ. And it might be even a little bit too crispy up on the top here. So I might pull out just a little bit of the high, super high end. And again, I'm soloing this so that you can hear it, but I would not make these decisions listening to it in solo. So let's pull it back out.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do.
And there we go. Now, if you really wanted it to have that really super spacious sound, of course, you can increase the level and give it more actual reverb sound.
You do what you want. You do what you want.
Yeah, cool. Now, the last thing worth mentioning here as we're talking about reverb is a very, very important setting here. It's called pre-delay. Without pre-delay, what's happening is we are hearing the reverb sound immediately, which tends to make the vocal sound further back in the mix. Essentially, it sounds like the vocal is literally further away. And so what pre-delay does is it waits to let us hear the reverb sound for whatever this number is set to. So the way it'll work now is it's going to wait 30 milliseconds before we hear the reverb. And what that allows us to do is keep that upfront vocal sound, and then 30 milliseconds afterwards, we hear the actual reverb sound as well. And so you might do this on both your long reverb and your short reverb. So I'm going to go in here and you notice how I'm seeing my vocal long reverb track right here. If I click on the knob for this send, you'll see it switches, and now I'm looking at the vocal short reverb. So I can click in the middle of the Space Designer, open that up, and then I'll just add a little bit of pre-delay over here. Usually 10, 15, 20, 30 or so milliseconds is good. If you go too long with it, it tends to create some weird effects, which might be interesting from a creative standpoint. But if we're just trying to be transparent about it, then usually somewhere around there is going to work just fine.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do what you wanna do.
Now at this point, I want to do just a real quick comparison. So these are all of our parallel effects. Remember, this was saturation, stereo delay, our short reverb, and our long reverb. Watch what happens when we take these all away.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want.
It is a huge difference. But on the flip side, if we went too high with all of these, you'll notice that it's going to create not only a much louder vocal, but a more or less out of control vocal. So let's turn them all off again and listen to this.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do.
And now the vocal's just kind of eating up the entire track. So we probably need to dial these guys back down again to tuck it back into the mix.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do what you wanna do.
And you notice as you change the balance between all four of these, it changes the overall tone of the vocal, but it also changes where the vocal is placed. It kind of pushes it further forward or further backward. The more reverb that we get, the more it tends to tuck the vocal back in and sometimes behind the mix. The less reverb that we get, the more it pulls it forward. The more of this delay that we get, the stereo delay that we add, the more it tends to spread it out off to the sides. It feels less central. And then the more saturation we give, the more it tends to push it back into the middle and up front, right in the center. So listen to that again and see if you notice the difference. Saturation will tend to bring it forward and center. The stereo delay will tend to push it off to the sides and make it wider, less focused. And then our two reverbs will tend to push it a little further back into the mix, especially with the long reverb. So listen to the difference here.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what.
All right, so it pushes it right in front and center.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you.
Here, it's very wide now.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want.
Feels further back.
You do what you want. You do what you wanna do.
Even further back. Right, and so this is as much about changing the tone of the vocal as it is changing the actual placement of the vocal. This is a huge amount of power you have with these four different settings here to really position the vocal exactly where you want it to be in the mix.
You do what what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do what you wanna do. You do what you want. You do what you wanna do.
And so that is it for our vocal reverb.